Hello, everyone. My name is Peter Browne, and I'm here to talk about a book that I wrote last year. It came out about 10 months ago, and the name of the book is Mountain Echoes. It's on Amazon now. The book is about two stories that have links together. They're intertwined, one in the present and one about 100 years ago, maybe 125 years ago. The present day story relates to the exploration of the local mountain trails here in Southern California, the San Gabriel Mountains, by a group of young people. The main characters are Brandon Landquist, who is a newly minted professor of geology at UCLA, and the young summer intern from Stanford. Her name is Darcy Shirey. Now, the older history that's intertwined with the present is the story of Professor Thaddeus Lowe. Professor Lowe is a very interesting character, and he is not as well known, I don't think, as he should be. So what I did in the book is I took segments that I thought were interesting from little snippets of Professor Lowe's life, and I put them in the story and to try to tie them in with the present. The book opens with the first field trip, you might say, into the San Gabriel Mountains, and they begin to see evidence of the past. At first, they somewhat interested in it, but not completely. They see remnants of an old hotel, and then a little bit later they see remnants of a mountain railway. There was a railroad train up in these mountains, and they're rather interested in that. They also have some individual past problems, you might say, or especially Professor Landquist. He's troubled by an event that he has tried to forget. He's been largely successful forgetting it, but he's buried it in his memory, something that happened when he was just a young Boy Scout of about 11 years old. But that memory seems to come back to him periodically in a very uncomfortable way. And as the story goes on, you'll see that he is no longer able or willing to keep that memory buried forever. He wants to open it up, explore it, and resolve it. Darcy also has some, you might say, uncomfortable feelings looking at her own future. She's a high-powered grad student at Stanford. She wants to spend her life in academics, and there's something possibly missing or something uncomfortable to her that this path holds for her. She may not like every aspect of this path. And as the book develops, they both allow these uncomfortable, somewhat unresolved issues come out, and that's part of the story of the book. So I actually discovered Professor Lowe myself by traveling up, hiking up these mountain trails and seeing the remnants of his efforts, his hotel and his mountain railroad, and reading about it and learning about it. I began to appreciate who Professor Lowe was and what he did. It was really quite an amazing life. One of the snippets that I thought I would tell you about a little bit is his attempt to cross the Atlantic Ocean in a hydrogen-filled balloon. He was a self-taught scientist, you might say. He called himself professor of chemistry. He never had any formal education beyond maybe grammar school at the most. But in those days, you didn't have to have a degree from UCLA or anything like that to call yourself a professor. But the term professor meant that you professed to the public. You were basically a public lecturer. That was enough to call yourself a professor. And that's what he learned how to do. He made his own balloons, and he invented a type of coating for the balloon that kept the gas from leaking out so much. But in about 1857, he was getting to be fairly well known as a balloonist. He would have his hydrogen-filled balloon at county fairs, and he would give public lectures for a fee, and he was developing a real profession this way. So he got a little carried away with himself and decided he wanted to be the first person to cross the Atlantic in a hydrogen-filled balloon. And he built an absolutely gigantic balloon. The capacity for this balloon was 785,000 cubic feet. It was huge. It was by far the largest balloon ever constructed. Now, this is to be distinguished from hot air balloons. A lot of people make the confusion. Lowe strictly used and was interested in hydrogen-filled balloons only. Now, he had a friend, Joseph Henry, who was head of the Smithsonian Institute, a very reputable scientist who acknowledged Professor Lowe as a legitimate scientist and an inventor. And he suggested maybe it's not a good idea to try to go across the Atlantic as you're on your first long-range balloon flight. Why don't you have a test flight from a western city? He suggested in those days Cincinnati. So in 1861, he decided to launch from Cincinnati. He knew very well that the wind directions varied, surface wind versus high altitude wind. And the best chance to get the high altitude winds going due east would be to see the surface winds going due west. So he had his balloon all ready to go, and he was waiting for just the right opportunity for the prevailing surface winds to be blowing to the west. Well, he was at a big dinner party in his honor in Cincinnati, and it was April 19th, 1861, and suddenly during the formal dinner and honor, messengers came rushing in and they said, the wind is blowing directly west, time to go. So he rushed out late at night to his balloon. Somebody gave him a hot cup of coffee. They also gave him a couple of rubber-filled, they were bottles made of rubber with water, so he would have water for the trip, and they gave him a bunch of blankets and everything. But he never had time to change his outfit. He still had his silk top hat and his black cape that he wore. That was his formal attire. So he got in the balloon. He launched at 3:30 in the morning, and his plan was to go all the way to the East Coast. And he, in his memoirs, published this event in quite a bit of detail. It's very fascinating to read, and I tried to summarize it in my book. He took off. He got up to about 3 miles high. That's the way he did his calculation. He had an altimeter on the balloon with him in the basket, which he invented, by the way. And he's traveling along, and he describes the sensation. One of the things about traveling in a balloon, even though he got to the upper level atmosphere and was headed due east at a very fast clip, but the sensation in the wicker basket that he was suspended from the hydrogen balloon is that there's no movement at all. Papers are not blowing around. There's no disturbance of the air. It's absolutely calm because you're in the wind, going with the wind, and nothing is disturbing. It was very peaceful. He saw the sun come up, and he was absolutely amazed, and he shot up to about 4.5 miles, which is well over 20,000 feet by any calculation. He could see at least 200 miles in the horizon. He could see the Atlantic Ocean, even though he was still in the middle of Virginia. He decided he didn't know exactly where he was because the wind velocity was so fast and his direction was, he was pushed somewhat south. He decided to lower the balloon, and by letting some gas out, he could lower the balloon, and he got down, and he found some people working in the fields. He had a megaphone with him, and he would shout down, where are we? Where am I? What state is this? Well, the people on the ground, they heard his voice. They're looking around. They're looking to the woods. They couldn't figure out where this voice was coming from. They finally spotted him coming down. They were horrified. They were frightened. They thought this was the strangest thing they'd ever seen. They got their rifles. They were gonna shoot him. He decided this wasn't the greatest spot to land, so he dropped over the side some sandbags that he used for ballast, went up a few hundred feet, and then proceeded further east. He found another spot that he thought was pretty good, and that was at Pea Ridge. He landed right on the border between North Carolina and South Carolina. He landed there, and he was captured. Some of the people, especially the slaves that were there, they were very kind to him. Some of the white folk were a little bit more nervous. They told him that the Civil War had just started about a week before. He was not aware of that. He was obviously a Yankee. They figured he must be a spy, and he had to be executed. They were going to execute him. Well, he darn near got himself executed. But because of his manner, I believe mostly, he was courtly. He said, "Gentlemen, let's talk this over. Brandy and cigars, I'm buying." And they took him into town. They took him to a jail, but the jail was full, so they took him to a hotel. And he told the innkeeper, bring us some food. I'll pay for it all. I want brandy, cigars. They got around the table, and they woke up some of the people at the hotel, and everyone was kind of curious. And he went on about this was a scientific endeavor, and he was no spy. He was just a scientist and an inventor, and they let him off. Well, he traveled to Cincinnati, but what he saw along the way was rather shocking to him, and it was not really appreciated in the North. What he saw along the train route was full-scale military mobilization in the South. Every train station was filled with young soldiers, supplies. They were all heading to Virginia to join the army. So when he got back to Cincinnati, he immediately notified his friend Joseph Henry at the Smithsonian, and he said, "I've got something to tell the federal government." Well, and not only that, I'm going to volunteer my services as a balloonist for military observation. His friend introduced him to President Abraham Lincoln. He met Lincoln. Lincoln talked to him for quite a while, was very interested in his ideas, and directed the acting general, Winfield Scott, to use Low in his ballooning. Well, Winfield Scott was an old fuddy-duddy and wouldn't use him. He didn't think there was any value in military observation. So he refused. He didn't pay any attention to Low. Well, the Battle of Bull Run took place, and it was a Confederate victory, Union loss. Washington was in a panic. They were, Maryland is a slave state, it didn't join the Confederacy, but was very sympathetic to the Southern cause. And Virginia, right across the Potomac River, was definitely Southern, rebel, Confederate, largest population in the Southern states. The army was massing there. People in Washington were scared to death that they were going to be attacked by the Southern Army. So they asked Low, finally, "Yes, you got to go up in the balloon and find out what they're up to." Well, he did. He did do that, and it was successful. And he was then asked to form the Union Balloon Corps, which he did. And they made observations for the next few years during the Civil War. Well, Professor Low had quite an experience during the Civil War, and I relate this in my book. There are other stories that are interesting, especially as they link to the present. I would like to get back to the story of Brandon and Darcy in the present time, and I'd like to show you my book. This is the book, Mountain Echoes, and if you would click on the link below, it will take you to the Amazon site, and I appreciate your interest. Thank you very much for watching.